You want to go?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Morning, everybody. You can always see the look of relief on people's faces, even in the morning when a politician takes the podium and he doesn't have a binder with him. I'm going to follow in the wake of his worship here and try and keep this relatively brief, but maybe just say a few words about the state of play of, as we see it, from the industry and all the exciting things that are going on in politics right now that may have an effect on what goes on here. First of all, just wanted to say every time I'm in Gander, Gander makes an impression on me. Starting at the age of 6 when I got 6 stitches on the balcony of the Albatross Hotel and leaned too far back and hit the railing. Excellent medical services here a few decades ago. I also remember growing up in Goose Bay, Labrador, and coming to Gander, which was a big deal for us, right? I mean, first of all, McDonald's, Tim Hortons, traffic lights. Back when you could take Timbits like you wouldn't believe as carry-on the EPA flight going back to Goose Bay. We were all very excited to come here for the Newfoundland and Labrador High School Drama Festival. And I'll let you in on a little something. I won Best Actor. It's not a big deal, but I beat Rip Mercer. Both says a lot about the choices we made in our lives, but anyway. I'm watching a current Prime Minister now who is in many ways similar and in many ways different from the Prime Minister that I worked for the 10 years that I was in federal politics. One of the great joys of my life, but it's a big responsibility for anybody who's elected from this province, almost as big as Minister of Fisheries, is being Minister of Natural Resources. And if you actually look at the GDP of the province here, you'll understand that we are far more dependent on natural resources. And dare I say, we're far more dependent on oil than even Alberta. This is what we do, and we've gotten really, really good at it over the years. I remember working in the provincial government for the Premier of the day, Brian Tobin, and some of you will remember, not an ounce of ore will come out of there unless we have the smelter. There was an entire election on that. There was basically an entire election back then in the late 1990s about mining, about what we mine, how we mine it, who should benefit. We're well versed in this stuff. And I still have, back in the days when Dr. Rex Gibbons was the Minister of Mines and Energy, and I was working for a fellow named Ed Roberts in the Clyde Wells government, I remember Rex actually jumping up and clicking his heels outside of the House of Assembly, actually doing that. I remember thinking, I thought only leprechauns did that on TV ads, but Rex Gibbons did it when he found out what was in Voisey's Bay. And he was kind enough, because I caught him doing it, to give me a core sample. The deal being that I would never repeat that story again, but here we are. And I still have that Voisey's Bay core sample on my desk. I had it all through politics, and it was particularly poignant to have it when I was Minister of Natural Resources. That it all begins somewhere. That it all begins in rooms like this, and it all begins in parts of the country like this. And some of the biggest finds in the world, I mean, you look at Voisey's Bay now, it's incredible. The industry you're in offers an awful lot of instability. I know that, learning that right back from when I worked for Premier Wells and then Premier Tobin. And wherever you can grab on to certainty, whenever you can grab on to a bit of security and a sure thing, all the better. And there isn't that much left in the world right now. That's the issue. So what we just saw in federal politics and in the election is not what a lot of people expected. Certainly no betting man or woman was going to count on basically a 35 to 40 point turnaround in the Liberal Party's fortunes. How the hell did that happen? I ask that, objectively, because by this time I wasn't running. That was because 10 years for me and my family was enough, and we just made that decision. But you sit back and you look at it, Conservatives had a 25-point lead. And yet we are, I think, 2 seats within a majority government. So the first thing I would say is that you got to come into that with all due humility. All due humility. That's what this government, this Prime Minister, I think, need to demonstrate. But you've got to come into it with all due humility. people definitely wanted a change. With Mark Carney as Prime Minister, they found the change. Now, a few things that I have seen him do that I recognize as a former Minister of Natural Resources that tells me he is absolutely serious when he talks about having to speed things up in this industry, in other natural resource industries, in being able to develop our resources more quickly and in order to be able to get them to market. Natural resources, you know, sometimes comes with some controversy from other quarters. Some of them have good points and some of them don't. Some are deliberately obstructionist and others have meaningful input, and sometimes it's hard to be able to discern the difference. But part of that is built into the process, right? We got frustrated about this back in the 90s and the 2000s in endless consultations, in endless red tape. This is hardly new. Courts have rendered numerous decisions that says rightfully that local people have a say and should be meaningfully consulted. And of course, the newest law, and the most important, really, and I say this also as somebody who grew up in Labrador and somebody who was a Minister of Indigenous Services as well, is that you got to get it right with First Nations and with Inuit. You got to. Stephen Harper and that Conservative government got, I think, rightfully frustrated with the whole thing, and the way they went about it was just to carry on, push it through, push legislation through, and get it past the courts. It didn't work, and it ended up just gumming up the whole works. We've tried a different way, but it also is taking time, right? We've tried a way in which we're trying to empower and make sure those consultations are meaningful for Indigenous people, but it ain't always easy, and it ain't always perfect. So let me begin there. One thing that I am seeing is that things are happening more quickly in consultations with Indigenous groups for a few reasons. Number one, they're impatient too. They will always be the primary beneficiaries of economic development, natural resource economic development in this country, as it should be. And they have gotten impatient too. They've gotten impatient with their own leadership. They've gotten impatient with the people that they hire to move the process along. And they want to see results faster. So that's very good. Secondly, I think that there's a growing appreciation amongst developers and amongst federal, provincial governments that the sooner we reach deals, the better. That is where investors get the kind of stability they want. They walk in knowing what the formula is, knowing who gets what, knowing who they have to talk to, and most of the bulk work about land use is already done. We had consultation, actually, this isn't Indigenous, but we had that for our offshore, and this is something that in the midst of COVID, nobody really talked about, but I was actually very excited about. Biggest ask of Energy NL to me when I became Minister of Natural Resources was, in order to get an exploration well done, just an exploration well done on the offshore, it took 300 days. 300 is still a lot. But the government before us, what they did is they basically overlooked us and forgot us, and exploratory wells became part of the major projects list. In other words, an exploratory well was treated like it was Hebron, the full platform. And it went from 300 days to 900 days to get an exploratory well done off the offshore. So we got it down to 90 days. And we got it down to 90 days by taking 1 year, it was a long year, in which we did the whole basin. We did basically the entire offshore in one big, sweeping environmental assessment, get it all. And actually, I turned around to environmentalists later who said, well, geez, you moved from 990, you know, you're not going to proper environmental oversight. I said, we're going to better environmental oversight. Because we're doing the whole kit and caboodle, and we'll have a better idea of how they all interact, as opposed to just doing a bit here, just doing a bit here, and doing the same bit here as we did here. So we got that done 990, and that's always been my model. And I have screamed and shouted all about that around the cabinet table and other places that I'm not supposed to talk about. Not supposed to talk about cabinet, but anyway. The Prime Minister then, in the last year that I was in office as Minister of Labour, he also made me chair, brace yourselves for this because it's quite a title, even for Ottawa, chair of the Ministerial Working Group for Regulatory Efficiency on Clean Growth Projects. Your mouth goes dry by the time you finish the end of my title. I couldn't find a business card. Even Ottawa couldn't find me an acronym. So what's the acronym? Everything in Ottawa is an acronym. Well, they couldn't give us one, so we came up with GREG. Anyway. But it was a bunch of heavy hitters. Chrystia Freeland was Minister of Finance on it. Francois-Philippe Champagne was on it. Jonathan Wilkinson, who was then Minister of Natural Resources. Paddy Haidio and Gary Adesangari covering off Indigenous issues. It was like, how do we reduce the red tape and get things done? Now, none of it, I'm going to tell you, really is rocket science. But in terms of how Ottawa moves and how slowly sometimes it moves, it was a big deal. First off, one project, one assessment. And this is something I saw Mark Carney repeating and repeating and repeating in front of crowds. And only in Canada can you get crowds riled up by saying, one project, one assessment. Only in a country where he said in an interview recently, his biggest lines were, we will eliminate internal trade barriers. And the Canadian crowd goes nuts. But these are long-standing things that we know that we got to do. So in other words, if there's one project, the federal and provincial government should agree that really should be only one assessment. And they're only doing that in BC now. We should be doing it in other places as well. We have made a significant agreement with the provincial government we made, I think, a year and a half ago on offshore wind. So that doesn't have to go through two assessments, right? That if it goes into federal jurisdiction, supposed to provincial by a kilometer, you know, like, what are we doing? So that's a big deal. One project, one assessment, and I believe that, you know, he is entirely serious about that. Secondly, the sooner we get agreements done with Indigenous groups, the better, and the more the better. Look, you saw proof of that in the announcement on Churchill Falls and on Gull Island. You haven't heard anything for the Innu because the deal's done. They did the deal in New Dawn. They did the deal with Muskrat Falls. In fact, the environmental assessment's done. So you haven't heard anything about consultation with the Innu or anything like that because it's done. And that means, you know, that's the model we need to work with. When we can come to an agreement in Labrador and in Newfoundland with Indigenous groups, so anybody who comes in here to invest knows exactly what they're getting into, that is what people are looking for. The third thing, knowing where you are in the process. And this is something that when I was Minister of Veterans Affairs, the greatest amount of anxiety that veterans would feel is, where am I in the process? Like, you know, I've applied for benefits. It's been 8 months. Where is it? Like, what's happening to it? And I said to the bureaucrats, look, you know, I understand when I got in there, the department had been gutted. So, you know, we had a lot of rebuilding to do and a lot of rehiring to do. And, you know, you're dealing with, you're dealing with people often traumatized or, you know, with, you know, significant physical and mental ailments. And so, you know, it's not just talking on the phone with them. You got to have them trained. You know, but what do you do in the interim? Domino's Pizza. Right? You order Domino's Pizza. Well, he's putting the red peppers on it now. Barry just put it in the oven. John just left with the pizza. At least you know where it is. And that's the way it should be with environmental assessment processes and permitting processes as well. This is exactly where you are. That will lower the tension and lower a lot of the, you know, pent-up anxiety that people feel. Right? So, you know, there were a number of others. I mean, you know, having that kind of a dashboard online and just continuing to do more of it. So, like, again, none of this is rocket science. Lastly, I would say this, that, you know, the bulk of what you have to do, the bulk of the people that you have to deal with really are in the provincial government and not the federal government. But I also say this in front of the mayor as well, that the more local the government, the better. The more you can really take meaningful consultation from people who live in the area. No, I'm not talking about just, you know, foolishness or obstructionist, but people who, you know, have meaningful concerns. The more you deal with them, the better you'll find solutions to those problems that they're confronting. Proximity matters. Proximity matters. When I would have fights about the importance of oil and gas with some of my cabinet colleagues, nobody could understand the oil and gas industry as well as anybody from Alberta or Saskatchewan or Newfoundland and Labrador. I got skin in the game, I would tell them. I look out the window of my office down on Water Street in St. John's during COVID and all that. I'd look out, I see supply vessels. I know the people who get on those supply vessels. They're my constituents. I got skin in the game. It is a different thing altogether when you are close to it. So, look, I want to applaud you all for being here in Gander, right? There are too many decisions that are made, and I say this as a Labradorian. Well, Labradorian and a townie. We're a weird mix. I got frustrated in Labrador, working for a Labrador MHA and a Labrador minister, by how many decisions were made in St. John's that really had where people from Labrador had no say in the matter and had no knowledge of how things really were going to work on the ground. And that was something that I took to Ottawa with me too. Not just in making sure that I defended Newfoundland and Labrador's interests, but I made sure that people in many regions, Ontario, Manitoba, Alberta, Saskatchewan, these are big provinces with northern areas and remote areas, that people in Edmonton, Calgary, Toronto, Vancouver, Victoria do not understand. And you got to have the humility to know that. It helps you make better decisions, right? When I made the decision to leave politics, unsure of where life would take me afterwards, I was looked at by a bunch of law firms in Toronto. And I had lived in Toronto back in my TV days for a long time. I know Toronto very well. I have tons of friends there. But why would I miss out where the action is, right? Action is here. You guys know that. You wouldn't be here in Gander in the curling club in the morning if you didn't know that the action's here. So if we can have a provincial government working with a federal government that is nimble and able to listen to you, all the better. The law firm I decided to go with is here, Stewart McKelvey, the biggest one in Atlantic Canada. And they're at the center of the action. The years ahead for our province, if we can get mining right, if we can continue with the offshore, if we can continue to show the world that we can do that, by the way, and lower emissions as well, and if we can proceed with the biggest capital works project in North America, $33 billion, this project with Churchill Falls, I am telling you, we cannot let anything get in the way of that happening. And I'll tell you why. And I'm not up here as a politician telling you this. I am up here as a very concerned Newfoundlander and Labradorian, looking out at the world as it is and seeing a project that gives us $1 billion cash every year and upwards of $300 billion in adjacent benefits and revenue. That is a huge, huge deal. So let's keep our eyes on prizes like that. The world is going to be tumultuous for the next little while. Like the Canadian ambassador in Washington told me, Kristen Hillman, and she's wicked smart. We dealt an awful lot together when I was Minister of Natural Resources and she was down in Washington. This isn't going away, she said. This instability, it is more than just one man down south. It is a significant change in American foreign policy. So I believe that when the Prime Minister goes on about the importance of building now, I think he's dead serious, because I think working at the Bank of Canada, working at the Bank of England, I think he's got a very good and clear view of the world as it is and not as we wish it to be. And he understands the importance of getting things built. Anybody paying attention to the cabinet selections that were made yesterday, he put in a fellow who ran Goldman Sachs in for the Minister of Natural Resources, Tim Hodgson. Haven't met him yet, looking forward to talking to him. It looks like he's a guy who wants to get things built and get things done. So the other very significant tell, and then I can see you're on the edge of your seat, so. I love it when she's on the edge of her seat. That means I'm just getting warmed up. No, I'm not, I'm finishing up. But if you're an economist and if you understand money like Mark Carney, I think what he's doing is very significant when he says we are going to separate budgets somehow. It's still all going to be transparent, but that there is a big difference between an operating budget for the federal government and in capital investments that are made. And if you put that out there and it's transparent, I think that that's fair. Trust me, after 10 years in the federal government, we need significant allocation of resources, tearing off the barnacles, call it whatever you want, but the government's gotten too big in terms of how it operates, and that needs to be looked at. But we need to make significant capital investments in order to make sure that we develop our product that the Americans need, but product that the world needs. I'm very proud that I broke ground on TMX out west on that expansion. That will help us get a fairer price for our resource, the biggest resource that we have in the country, right? And we have to follow that same model now with ports all around the country, including in the north, to make sure that we get the best prices for our product. Regardless, where you are investing here in Newfoundland and Labrador, don't forget about that map. I have a map in all my offices that I just love. the Newfoundland map of the world, the Newfoundland-centered map of the world. You know the one, right? It's not the one that has us on the arse end of Canada and then the edge of the map. It's the one that has us in the middle of the G7. Our proximity to markets matters. We are in the center of the action. This place is in the center of the action. That is why we are here. Thank you very much for having me. Really appreciate it. I know, I can see you.
Faster than dominoes.
Thank you very much.